Hey fam, welcome back. Tisha here, back for another chapter reading of The Witness War Read. Do me a favor and hit the like button as we jump into chapter 9, Sweet Promises of Destruction. What kind of chapter, Niam? For the rest of the month, spooked by Warren's words, I look for any priesthood approved reason to be away from home. I performed with hundreds of FLDS members in the Pioneer Day Parade on the 24th of July. I also signed up for an EMT class with Christine. Warren admonished me for the amount of time I spent away from home, but as long as Rulon approved of each activity, he couldn't stop me. I went back to enduring my duty in the bedroom, though our shifts were lightened as Rulon now had 14 young wives to please him in the bedroom. We were now on 12-hour shifts instead, but I was never allowed to escape from duty. I played the good wife when I had to, so I could leave whenever possible. And every day I prayed to God I did not like or trust that He would somehow have mercy on my soul. Then in August 1998, when Rulon was visiting Short Creek and my sister wives and I were gathered together for family class, Rulon suddenly slumped over. We helped Nephi carry him, or is it Nephi, Nephi, carry him to his bed, and the paramedics were called. As we watched, Rulon began spouting absurdities, and it was apparent he recognized only Mother Ruth. We were stunned. Nephi later announced over the intercom that Rulon had suffered a severe stroke and was receiving treatment at the hospital in St. George. Now, y'all know it had to be serious if they let that man, the prophet himself, go to the hospital. We certainly could not all visit for fear of attracting attention. Through Nephi, Warren ordered all of us to stay home from church and to refrain from entertaining visitors. He wanted us on call 24/7 for anything he or his father needed. In the meantime, Warren immediately flew to St. George. Upon leaving the hospital, he warned Rulon's wives, do not reveal his condition to the people. At that point, Warren instructed every member of Rulon's family to fast and pray for his recovery. Although we were used to fasting once a month for 24 hours to pray for a specific need for the priesthood, this was an extended fast from food. We were allowed only to sip water, mint tea, or apple juice. In addition, no one was allowed to leave the property or even talk on the phone except to tell the people the prophet was getting some rest. Essentially, y'all are lying to everybody. That's what's going on here. They're known for being liars with when it comes to the way that they handle this situation, and he was not supposed to die. So I imagine that the various priesthood holders were probably trying to find a way to explain this. Essentially, we were under house arrest, and the people were left in the dark about the whole thing. Helen and I were going to miss our on duty night with Rulon. So Nephi arranged for us to drive down to the hospital for his EKG test. As soon as the test was finished, Warren told us to leave, as Rulon was not making good progress. It was disturbing to see my husband in that kind of condition, and I couldn't help but feel guilty for all of the angry thoughts I had harbored towards him. Our 89-year-old seer and revelator had prophesied to us that he would live for 150 years and be present to give the keys of the kingdom to Christ himself. That alone is hard for me to understand how they didn't find this to be odd that this man said he would live to be 150 years old, and here he is at 89 getting ready to not make it. And y'all aren't sitting there saying to yourself, oh, there may be something wrong with this. But then I got to remind myself, this is a cult. And they very much so find ways of blaming people for why certain things didn't happen the way that they're supposed to, much like they're going to do in this situation. In tender moments, perhaps feeling embarrassed that he could no longer sire children in a society that so revered it, he had told his younger wives that he would be renewed like, where was I? He would be renewed like Peleg in Genesis, Chronicles, and the Doctrine and Covenants. He said that he would father 300 children for us. This hospitalization felt unreal. So many stories of the miraculous healing of prophets were pounded into our heads daily that we genuinely believed that Rulon Jeffs would be the next prophet to experience life saving and life giving miracles. Not a single one of us expressed any doubt. Not only was it unsafe to do so, but we codependently bolstered one another in our blind obedience. We sang songs about keeping sweet, never complaining, never questioning, and sacrificing our feelings to do what was right. Later, Rulon was released into his son's custody and immediately flown back to Salt Lake City, Salt Lake, where his son could monitor his progress. Warren also took over most of the daily duties while the prophet was ill. To the people, Warren announced that while Rulon had suffered a stroke, he was in great health and simply needed rest, which was not true. Word spread quickly, and the people were very concerned about the prophet's health. Some of the men in the hierarchy were concerned about Warren's leadership, but not one person dared to openly confront him. A dark sense of foreboding came over the house. My sister wives and I continued fasting, but began to grow frail as the days turned into weeks. The next time it was my turn to be on duty with Rulon, I was alarmed at how severely the stroke had ravaged his body. Our sister wife, Mary, had been watching over him almost nonstop. The prophet was hooked up to several wires and indicators, all monitored by Mary, a registered nurse. My EMT classes enabled me to help by writing accurate medical notes for her. When I went into an adjoining room to record medication intake, I heard voices coming from the side door near the garage where entitled individuals would come to visit the prophet without enduring the formalities of the front room as most visitors did. The Barlow brothers, several of the prominent community leaders who were descended from the earlier prophet John Y. Barlow, had arrived for their regular monthly meeting with the prophet. Warren suddenly rushed through, accompanied by his brothers Nephi and Isaac, who had been taking orders from him since the stroke. Do not grant them access, he said. Do not tell them anything. I lowered my head and continued to write, shocked as I watched them from under my lashes. They backed away from the door, but perched nearby to listen. Isaac opened the door and greeted the men, though quite obviously barring them from entering. We know the prophet has been ill, said Dan Barlow slowly, though authoritatively. He and his brothers were taken aback at being held at the door. We simply wish to extend him our well wishes and prayers for his speedy recovery. Thank you, said Isaac politely but firmly. The prophet is resting and no visitors are allowed. A strange look crossed the men's faces. The proud sons and grandsons of a prophet stood there, stunned and angry, for several uncomfortable moments before turning away. It was a scandalous changing of the guard. In time, Rulon's condition, did I skip? No, I didn't. In time, Rulin's condition gradually improved, and thankfully, some of the tension eased in our home. Fortunately, the rigid fasting led up to. However, if Rulin had an especially rough night, Warren would blame the wife on duty for not having enough of the Spirit of God within her. Do you understand how damaging that is to someone's psyche? Where you're sitting here and you're blaming them for this thing when they're already starving themselves and doing all these things. And we know a lot of them are already extremely thin. And here they are doing this because you have these people actually believing that by them doing this, that this is going to create some type of miraculous thing in this man's body. And the more that they do it and the longer that they do it, that the more he's supposed to be healed. Here's the thing, and this is coming from someone who has fasted before. I don't think that it's meant to be weaponized. And to me, he's weaponized it. So I don't see it being successful if that's what he's doing. What influence are you bringing around Father? He would ask. Can you not see? He is so pure. His instantaneous, his insinuations, frighten me. What if Father died on our watch? Would we be blamed for that too? Rulon experienced debilitating fallout from the stroke. While his physical body and strength began to slowly improve, our husband could not recognize his wives, nor call each one of us by name. Slowly, he began to remember some of his oldest wives, LaRue, Julia, Ruth, and Marilyn. Except for Mary, who cared for him daily, the rest of us became Sweetie. For the next several months, Rulon was as daffy as a post. I want all of my wives to dye their hair just like theirs. He pointed to Paula and Ellen with their jet black hair. We all gasped at first and then sat in shocked silence. FLDS women were forbidden to dye their hair, a vanity of the outside world frowned upon by our leaders. Isaac quickly retrieved Warren, who put the whole thing to rest. Otherwise, as obedient wives, we would have had all departed promptly to St. George for hair dye. Everything the prophet says is right. We had heard hundreds, if not thousands, of times in the morning in family classes. Never question, always obey. Still, we couldn't help but notice that our husband was not in his right mind. I'm not Rulon, he began, insisting stubbornly. I'm Rudy. He was adamant and proud of his name in a childlike way. So it made sense that when Mother Ruth explained it was a nickname his father had given him as a toddler. So it made sense when Mother Ruth explained it was a nickname his father gave him as a toddler. One Sunday at church, I was on duty with Rulon. It was part of my job that day to make sure he was not approached before his sons could whisk him away. Because we got to keep up the rules. We got to keep making these people think that he's just resting and that he's okay. He was not allowed to speak publicly at this point, nor allowed to speak privately with anyone. Whenever Rulon tried to speak, Warren and his brothers muted the lapel microphone he usually wore at church, and that way they completely controlled what was said. When Warren and Uncle Fred sat next to Rulon, as my sister wives and I sat in the first few rows of the seats across from the pulpit, we could hear Rulon speaking when most of the congregation could not. I couldn't help but see how Warren carefully used every opportunity to place responsibility for the people squarely on his own shoulders and to bring their attention away from Rulon and back to their iniquity and sin. Father's condition is like that of Moses on the mountainside. My goodness, oh gracious, said Warren, standing up to the pulpit. We cannot understand it all, but he is in direct contact with God. Then Warren looked sternly out over the crowd, which went completely silent. And when you murmur, you are like Moses' people, senselessly imbibing in debauchery and Alexa, how do you pronounce Revelry?
I pronounce that revelry,
I thought
but
so.
I'm always
Alexa,
working
stop.
on how I say things to make
Alexa,
myself.
stop. She don't listen. And revelry, while he is seeking only the Lord's will. It has been brought to the prophet's attention that people are putting paper up in their windows so they can watch television and no one will know. Again, his voice boomed scathingly out across the congregation. God and the prophet know your sins. This man can't even talk. When he does talk, he's not even saying people's names. He can't even remember his wife's names except for a couple of them. Everybody else is sweetie. And you're up there standing in the pulpit talking about how he knows y'all are watching TV and stuff. Get out of here. When we returned home from church, dinner wasn't ready, but Uncle Rulon wanted to eat immediately and was acting cranky like a toddler who had not had his nap. Sometimes his physical discomfort caused him to become very mean. Nephi patiently brought out Rulon's television and put on national geographic video about bears in Northwest. They're not supposed to be watching TV, but he can watch TV. I'm just saying, like, it's it's so blatant. This bothered me. As everyone had just heard Warren literally attack people for watching television. Why then was it okay for the prophet and his family to watch? Rulon sat, spellbound, providing commentary and clapping his hands. At one point in the show, he watched a bear catch a salmon. I always say that word wrong. Salmon, right? You don't pronounce the L. Salmon, salmon, and eat it. He suddenly leaned forward with as much force as his age ridden body would allow and nearly toppled over. Oh my God, he shouted as the bear ripped into the salmon's mouth with his great teeth. Bears are barbaric. Hearing Rulon shouts, some of the other sister wives came running, expecting the worst. Rulon asked them to stay and watch the show with him as he continued his commentary. Nephi quickly exchanged that video for a program on nuclear war and the impending doom of the world in an effort to placate his father until Warren came in to give Rulon a snack. When we gathered for dinner a short while later, Rulon was slumped over in his chair. I wonder if Warren had drugged him. I paid attention and began to notice a pattern. If Rulon was really outspoken or talking crazy, his sons would intervene, and 15 to 20 minutes later, he'd be asleep. So they were drugging him. That's what was going on. They were drugging him. From time to time, Rulon would have periods of lucidity. He was lucid. Yeah, okay. Alone with Rulon at lunch one afternoon. My sister wives and I were perplexed when our husband began beating his fist on the table in great anger and frustration. I want my job back. Damn it, he cried, looking around at us. We knew what he was talking about. Are you listening to me? The prophet screamed at us again. I want my job back. Each word was accentuated with another fist upon the table. Warren and Isaac rushed in to soothe him, and a few minutes later, he was asleep in his chair, his mouth open in a drooling snore. Warren could be heard to say, I am only doing my father's will, even more frequently. However, it was becoming obvious to us in the Just family that Warren was now directing the will of his father. The last year of the millennium turned into a living hell for the FLDS as ruling continued to decline and Warren began dictating disturbing doctrine about the end of the world. The term Latter day Saints was coined by the early Mormons over a century prior because they had felt they were experiencing the last days. Our FLDS prophets had instilled the concept of doomsday only deeper into our consciousness, and we all braced ourselves for the arrival of the year 2000. When school ended in May, everyone in the Just family moved to Hilldale. We all scared about 2000. Did y'all think the computers were going to go out? I can't remember. I don't think I really cared as a kid. I don't it didn't well, I wasn't a young kid. It didn't much matter to me as a teenager though. Warren warned the people in Salt Lake City that the prophet wanted them to sell their businesses, pack up their personal items, and move down to Short Creek as soon as possible. They obeyed and began coming down in droves. Warren had already moved down with his wives and children in Hilldale, where I'd gone deliberately to get away from him. I found myself under his constant thumb once again. That July, my own family prepared to join us. Tempers had been running high in the Wall household for months. Our father felt that my mom's children did not honor his priesthood authority. Mother Maggie had been feeding into that belief again, and the kids felt powerless against her manipulations. One afternoon, Mom told me and Christine she had been at a car wash several blocks from home when she saw Zach staggering toward her on foot. Her first thought was that his older twin brothers, or perhaps one of his other mothers, had gotten a hold of him. When she learned that would when she learned that it was actually our father who had beaten and bloodied Zach in his rage, all because of a misunderstanding, she decided her children should not have to suffer any longer. Oh boy. She called Warren and within a day left home with her children, never to return again. Good for her. But it makes me wonder because it's not the first time that her kids had been beaten up on. How bad was it that now she was like done? As she described the severity of Zach's injuries, I was relieved that she had taken matters into her own hands, but my heart ached for her and her loss. My father had rescinded his right to be a father under those circumstances. The prophet seemed to think the same way. Dad's priesthood was revoked once more, and my mother and siblings, as well as Maggie and her children, were taken from him. So it wasn't so much as that. It's like, okay, so here's the thing. I just celebrated the fact that she left, but she's probably going to be placed into another man's care because they don't treat these women like they can handle their own. Yeah. Dad and Irene moved down near us, but into a trailer house on the southern outskirts of town. He was stricken from the prophet's good graces, though he was still a member of the church, having to repent from afar in order to be able to hold the priesthood again. In August, that August, Christine informed me that Warren had arranged for our mother to move down to Uncle Fred Jessup's home in Hilldale. Uncle Fred, the bishop of the Hilldale area, often took in widows and displaced families. That didn't set well with me, knowing that Rulon enjoyed giving women with children to Uncle Fred for marriage. Yeah, she's being pushed off onto somebody else. Oh boy. Unable to have children of his own as a side effect from a childhood bout with measles, Fred had been given well more than a dozen wives with children already. I prayed that somehow my mother could simply be placed in a quiet setting where she could have time to heal and have peace without having to marry again. Christine and I spent quite a bit of time trying to comfort our brothers and sister. Joshua and Jordan, now 17, refused to come to Hydale, but Mom still had Zach, Alyssa, Levi, Sherry, and Allie with her, all of whom just wanted to go home. My fears came true when our mother was given to marry beloved Uncle Fred, and they were given along with her. I was most worried because I had seen several families suffer at Fred's hands, not because he was abusive, but because he was so very intolerant. Before my mother came to live with him, I saw that, like many FLDS leaders, he had a double standard for his behavior and that of his people. It particularly irked me one Sunday when he spoke piously at the pulpit about the importance of being gentle with children. Then that afternoon, he went home, and while we were preparing a family meal, he publicly shamed and ridiculed one of my brothers in front of his very large family. Unfortunately, mom didn't have any resources. Oh, FLDS women rarely ever owned any property. I just had to bite my own words. She wouldn't have been okay. She wouldn't have been okay. Either way, they're bound. She certainly had no means to support herself and her brood of children. And since mom had been dad's second wife and therefore a celestial bride with a less than legal marriage license, she therefore had no legal way to get a divorce. Her marriage to my father was dissolved the moment the prophet presented her and her children to Fred. It was done. I tried to be cheery and optimistic on my mother's wedding day. Warren performed the ceremony in Rulon's home, and everyone went to Fred's afterward for music and celebration. As I looked around the room at the other women and children, I saw some faces that were very kind, others cold or jealous, and still just others, and still others just dead. The things these women and children had already been through were tough to think about. Most had been taken from their husbands and fathers and given to Uncle Fred, generally for reasons of severe abuse. I went through the line to wish Mother and Uncle Fred my congratulations. I gave my mom a huge hug and bent over to hug Uncle Fred in his chair, and he pulled me toward him, turned his face directly to mine, and kissed me right on the lips. Oh no. Please don't let him do anything to those little girls. Oh, goodness. I backed up in shock and he just laughed. Who was this man? If anyone else had dared to kiss the prophet's wife like that, he would be kicked out of the FLDS in a heartbeat. Although I would come back frequently to visit my family, I steered clear of Fred whenever possible. It seemed he had the same depraved sense of entitlement I noted among most other FLDS leaders. The night of mom's wedding, I could not sleep for worry over my siblings. Alyssa, Levi, Sherry, and Allie were still quite young. I feared especially for Zach and Levi. Hundreds upon hundreds of boys had already been kicked out of the FLDS. With very little education and nowhere to turn, their futures were very dim. We called them sons of perdition, but we heard that the outside world had begun to call them the Lost Boys. Great book. Great book. I'm going to go back and listen to my playlist because I even though there was some really tough parts in there, that was a good book. That made me mad. People on the outside didn't understand. It wasn't like Peter Pan who didn't want to grow up. These lonely boys came from a culture where God and family meant everything, literally everything. And once kicked out, they had neither. I don't think we thought of it, I know I didn't, as a Peter Pan syndrome. I thought of it as exactly what it says: lost boys, lost young men that do not know where to turn because they have been raised in a way that makes it harder for them to function in society. They weren't lost, they were abandoned. Over the next few months, it broke my heart to see every one of my younger brothers end up in that category. Oh, wow. Wow. Trevor was already gone, and Joshua and Jordan, who couldn't stand living in such an abusive environment with dad, left to live with friends. Then Uncle Fred set up my sweet brother Zach on some trumped up charge in order to send him to work camps in Canada. He escaped on the way there, and I didn't blame him. Still, It was anguishing to imagine my little brother hiding out in Salt Lake City somewhere, perhaps sleeping on a park bench or under a bridge. Not long after that, some boys came and picked up my baby brother Levi in the middle of the night. He was only 11. We were all distraught at his disappearance, but somehow I knew that Zach was involved and that he really cared for Levi. I prayed that they be safer out there than in Uncle Fred's home. Now only my little sisters remain. With the dramatic shifts within the Jeffs household and the FLDS at large, I had never felt more concerned and unsure about their future. As the months progressed and December drew to a close, the paranoia and anxiety among the people was at an all time high. On New Year's Eve, we had a sobering family class. I looked upon the troubled faces of my sister wives as we listened to Warren's faithful pronouncements. Everything would blow up. California was about to drop into the ocean. Unless I was considered pure enough to be lifted up with the righteous while the rest of the world perished, I would die with them at the ripe old age of 23. Okay, so I kept saying that she was older than she was because she talked about how many people he married after her. But at this point, everything that we heard has happened and she's only 23. That is wild. Our class ended around 11:15 p.m. and there were no rumblings yet, although everyone seemed poised to spring at a moment notice. Finally, my sister wives and I all hugged one another tightly before going to bed. We believed we would not see one another in the morning unless we were pure enough to be lifted up together in the eternities. I walked soberly down the long stretch to my room, locked in a distressful review, convinced I would never be worthy of the life in eternities with the prophet. Finally, I took a long shower to emerge into the deathly quiet of the house, the silence closing in somberly around me. As I slipped into bed, all I could hear was the tick, 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 tick of the clock. I was so scared. I hadn't bothered to set my alarm. According to Warren, we wouldn't be waking up, and we'd all believed him. This was it, the end of life as anyone had ever known it. I pulled the blankets up to my chin and gripped the edges tightly in my fear. It was nearly midnight. 11:57, 11:58, 11:59. I held my breath and waited. Then something occurred to me. What time zone was God in? Wasn't it already past midnight in New York? Wouldn't midnight in that wicked place have been a really great time to blow the earth away in a dramatic gesture of retribution? I finally let out a breath I had been holding, and about half an hour later, I fell into a restless sleep. And that's where we're going to end it. It's chapter after chapter. Matter of fact, I halfway feel like, should I read these next couple pages? You know what? Let me see. Yeah, what y'all think? I think y'all are gonna say yes. I think y'all are gonna say yes. No. Yeah, okay. Sorry. Chapter 10, God's law is above man's law. The next morning, New Year's Day. Oh, she's jumping. I greeted my sister wives in the kitchen. Oh no, she's not jumping. Duh, New Year's. We all glanced at one another, a little shell shocked. We felt relieved until Warren told us later that day that the prophet said that God had given us just a little more time. The end of the world was still imminent, but we were too wicked to be saved. Once again, we needed to repent. Yeah, of course it's their fault because they're a bunch of liars and that's how you trick the people. Got it. I watched my entire community try to come back to the grips of reality. wholeheartedly believing we were on the brink of destruction. A wild recklessness had taken over the previous months. Why not buy large pieces of equipment or rack up credit card debt if no one would be left to be accountable to the after the destructions? Unfortunately, now there were actual worldly consequences for our spiritual beliefs. With a breaking heart, I witnessed several of my closest relatives and friends struggle under the burden of confusion and horrendous debt. I didn't even think about the debt piece. The exception was the prophet's household. We continued living as we had before, on the tithes and offerings of the people, which now unsettled me. A scripture often quoted from the pulpit was Malachi 3:8. Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Anyone who did not pay at least a tenth of every dollar that he or she earned was cheating God. That was unacceptable. Our struggling people would take food from their own mouths and those of their children, but they would not rob their God. Many did, however, take money from the government via welfare, Medicaid, and food stamps, especially celestial wives and their children. Not considered legal wives, they used their maiden names to apply for benefits. Subsidies accounted for millions of dollars, much of the community's income. After how my father had raised us, it was uncomfortable for me to sit at the front of the church while the leaders taught us it was noble and holy to take government subsidies to bleed the beast or run the evil government into the ground. We were told that God's law was always above man's law, so nothing the priesthood did was considered illegal. And whereas in Salt Lake, we avoided police and government at all costs, here in our small area, where nearly everyone was FLDS or had immediate affiliation to the FLDS, we were on our own law enforcement and government. Excuse me, we were our own law enforcement and government. So it's not illegal for you to do the things you do because y'all are, these great people, but yet you hide them from the law. That doesn't make sense to me, but it goes back to their doctrine. Every town official, municipal director, and police officer was FLDS, subject to the prophet's rule, not to state or federal laws. Nearly 5 decades of previous, during the 53 raid, which was the largest mass arrest in modern American history, in which the entire community was taken from their homes. Outsiders saw photos of children being ripped from their mother's arms. It was a public relations fiasco for Arizona Governor Powell, and it caused his campaign to backfire. That was when our people had basically been left alone to govern ourselves, left in our own little niche that Arizona and Utah basically pretended didn't exist. The church and our people had taken full advantage of it. No one bothered us. We literally became a law unto ourselves, which is why they were able to get away with so much perversion for so long. A similar situation had taken place within the FLDS. Before Uncle Roy had passed, a falling out had occurred among the people re- regarding one man rule. Those who followed Uncle Roy Johnson and then Rulon were subject to rule by that one man who acted only in the name of God, doing God's will. Now, as Rulon's health deteriorated rapidly, Warren acted more boldly in the name of his father. Respected priesthood men were still being given little or no access to the prophet, and Rulon was rarely making appearances at church. Questions were being asked among our people. What really is happening? Everyone wondered. Rulon's business had always been conducted in a fairly open manner, at least to insiders of the FLDS hierarchy. Now, however, much was happening behind closed doors. My sister wife, Mother Noreen, had been Rulon's personal secretary for years in Hilldale, always taking care of his needs. Abruptly, Noreen was replaced by Nephi, Warren's brother. Nephi said he was Rulon's new secretary, but it was obvious to us in the Jeffs household that Nephi was reporting directly to Warren. One day earlier, in the year 2000, Nephi came into the dining room and whispered something into Warren's ear. Warren turned to us. Uncle Dan Barlow, Uncle Joe Barlow, and Winston Blackmore are demanding to see Father. The room went deathly quiet. You are witnessing the suffering of the people for a godly purpose. God knows more than we do why Father is having to be silent for so long as he communes with God. Say nothing to the people. Say nothing. With Rulin's deteriorating health, we were back under near house arrest. Some could sit for long periods of silence at the feet of our sick husband while Warren taught us incessantly. Others struggled like I did. I did my best to hide my unrest and kept as low as a profile as possible. When I had been very busy with the operettas, I had been giving a pager so the prophet's sons could get messages to me and Christine. I never gave mine back, keeping it hidden in my pocket. Besides the phone in my room, it seemed my only connection to the outside world, and I carefully protected it. Aside from my immediate family, Nephi was the only one who knew about it. I don't know why, but he turned a kind blind eye, probably liking the fact that he could reach me if no one else could. I used the pager to send messages to the people I loved, my sisters, my mother, and my friend Samantha. During church services and now my infrequent visits to Mom, I observed an extreme sense of discontent among the people. Warren could no longer silence their questions. He resorted to other means to keep our minds preoccupied with the work of God. In the midst of unrest, the marriage rate among our people suddenly skyrocketed. Since Rulon's stroke, Warren had sanctioned and performed only a couple of marriages each weekend in the name of his father. But by the late fall of 2000, Warren began performing as many as 20 marriages or more per week. Insane. At first, weddings were a great cause for celebration. Our people thrived on such unions as we knew all the families involved. It seemed a joyous time. For my sisters and sister wives and me, still fasting frequently for long periods and rarely allowed out into the community, observing the marriages had become our only means of entertainment. Each morning we would race out to the front window to see which couples were being wed, most often celebrating with them in our hearts and with great hopes for their futures. As the marriages increased so rapidly, however, the girls over 20 were snapped up quickly, and the marriages of younger girls began to take place. One morning, I looked out to see Sophia, a vibrant, beautiful senior in high school whom I directed in multiple operettas and who was immensely talented on the violin. My sister wives clapped and cheered as they saw who her husband would be. To my chagrin, I saw that it was Louis Barlow. Yes, she would be set for life as far as standing in the community and riches. But Louis was well into his 70s. I had to turn away. Oh my goodness. Shortly before she exchanged vows with Louis, I was able to slip out and give her a hug. She cried a little in my arms. These life changing rites of passage should be joyous for all of the people involved. All I felt was deteriorating faith. It didn't take long to get to the girls as young as 12. Stories began running rampant among the FLDS about Jesus' mother, Mary being 12 when she became pregnant. In a very twisted way, it became almost a sign of holiness to justify a wedding for one so young. Goodness gracious. With hundreds of these girls being married off, I could not help but feel dread and horror. Mm. Some marriages were deliberately staged to breed out rebellion. For example, my uncle Frank Steed had a daughter, Kimberly, who had been getting into trouble for going to parties. I was shocked when I saw that as a teen, she was given in marriage by her father to none other than Jonathan Roundy, the local police officer and staunch FLDS member, the very officer who had arrested her for going to the party. That is wild. The priesthood found this amusing, and I overheard several snide comments about my cousin among the men in the Jeff's home that she was a feisty animal needing to be put in her place, and now all her rebellion would be bred out of her from one strong enough to hold the reins. In other words, we're going to grape her until she submits. This is crazy. Even more disturbing to me, I couldn't help but see that powerful men in the church were suddenly much less outspoken against Warren following their marriage to some very young lady, so young that the outside world would prosecute the men were they to get caught. I realized Warren was skilled at creating not only collaborations but collusions. To justify such a change in marriageable ages, Warren explained, "We've got to take care of the people," as if he was protecting our way of life from the government. That was a lie. For decades, even generations, the FLDS had not allowed many underage unusually marriages, usually waiting until a girl was close to 18. Warren blamed Utah and Arizona, which had begun enacting stricter laws regarding bigamy and underage marriages. Warren actually places people under great condemnation due to these new laws. We became worried since the marriages were being performed in Rulon Jeff's home. The prophet's son stirred the paranoia, saying, "If discovered, we might have to go into hiding." Everyone became hush hush about marriages taking place. Soon, Warren had all the couples secret. Alexa, how do you pronounce Secreted? She not answering me. Okay, Warren had all the couples secreted across the border to well, oh Lord, get it, girl. Cali, Caliente. That ain't Caliente, is it? Alexa, how do you pronounce Caliente?
I pronounce that caliente.
Oh, it
but
is.
I'm not
Alexa,
so
stop.
sure.
Caliente, Nevada, where the underage laws were much less strict and where Uncle Mero could use his Caliente hotel as a quiet place to perform the marriages away from prying eyes, especially when very young girls were marrying much older men. While I had realized some time ago that matches were not ordained by God and certainly not whispered into the prophet's ear, the message was still being taught to all of the young FLDS girls. What I saw were the wealthiest men given the most money in tithes, accumulating the largest number of young wives. Warren couldn't give their profit back to those men, but he could raise their standing and make them happy by passing out young women like candy. Warren even used this tactic to pacify his own father. Whenever Rulon would start to question what was happening with his authority, he would suddenly get a new bride. Our ancient husband found it difficult to be cantankerous when he was distracted by a fresh young bride for a time. Warren was accumulating more wives as well, ones with really good looks or really good standing or both. They also seemed to get younger and younger. To keep the gene pool fresher, teen and preteen girls were smuggled in from Canada to the United States and others back again in Rulon's camp trailer equipped with a bathroom so they would never be seen in public. We did not know all the details, but from time to time, as news came in, I couldn't help but see the one for you and two for me priesthood transactions, as the men in power and standing in both the United States and Canada were definitely the ones accumulating. Even the most loving fathers found it difficult to say, "My daughter is too young to marry," when Warren made a trade. Most men were ineligible to resist a new young wife who could be molded to their desires before she got a mind of her own, as well as the promise of higher standing in the community and in heaven. Even though Warren said he was only the voice of the prophet, no one wanted to tell him no. Very soon they wouldn't dare. During that year of 2000, the U.S. Census was being taken. Warren decided our people should take its own, as our records were of earthly and heavenly consequence and should not be left in the hands of the Gentiles. Generally, we did not share accurate records with them anyway. We included vital records such as baptisms, marriages, family records, bishop records, and priesthood ordinances, as well as births. Several of my sister wives were heavily involved in inputting data into the Jeff's computers. I helped create one of the templates, and when the ladies became overwhelmed by thousands of records pouring in, I helped to sort them. Joyful news spread among the people that we were now 10,000 strong. We were following the Lord's commandment to multiply and replenish the earth. It seemed a sign from heaven to lend us confidence that we were indeed the Lord's people, and I strived to feel that confidence. However, over 60% of our population was under the age of 16. Are you hearing that? 60% of their population was under the age of 16, compared to the 20 to 31% in the surrounding areas, which meant that Warren had to keep thousands of young people under control. Local police cracked down on socializing to the point that girls and boys were not allowed to gather under any circumstances except at church and work meeting. While we all knew that local authorities were under the thumb of the FLDS Church, I witnessed firsthand how authorities bent the law for those on the prophets' errands. I had a lead foot and got caught speeding dozens of times. However, I never received a ticket because no officer would want Rulon to hear about it. It also went the other way. For example, my brothers and other young men, no longer in Warren's good graces, were often pulled over, bullied, or even arrested for no real reason. Rodney Holm, a local police officer sworn to duty in both Utah and Arizona, was pleasant and soft around Rulon and Warren, but I had seen him menace and humiliate others. He had been a naughty kid himself, but now he used his badge to enforce Warren's wishes. Rodney and his sidekick, Hellman Barlow, another local policeman, broke up gatherings where FLDS teens were just trying to hang out like normal kids. I knew a boy named Brian Steed very well. Besides the fact that he was my first cousin, I had been the pianist for their senior class program and had worked with him in 3 operettas. Although he constantly clowned around, deep inside he was a good, hardworking boy. One Friday evening, I drove to the grocery store in Colorado City to pick up a few things, and I waved to Brian, who was in the parking lot chatting with some friends. When I came out, I saw that Rodney and Hellman had dragged him out to the center of town, bright police lights flashing as the officers made a big animated show of cuffing him and throwing him up against their car under the pretense of checking him for a DUI. After hours had passed, they had to let him go because they had nothing to hold him on, but the humiliation had been wrought. Years later, Brian would lose his life, and it would break my heart to see his name added to the long list of FLDS boys and young men who had overdosed on drugs or taken their lives. There could never be enough time for these people in sentencing. I just they destroyed so many lives that in my opinion they deserve theirs to be destroyed as well. Some of you may disagree with me, but I just males were not the only ones to pay the price for living under such a rigidly controlled police state. Under Rulon and then Warren, local police officers would rarely interfere when a father or brother forced a runaway teen or bride back home. There was nowhere safe to report exploitation or maltreatment. From the girls I knew, often the abuse and the public and private humiliation became worse after returning home. It was little to no wonder that few women tried to leave or to report it. It certainly didn't seem safe to report it outside of the community either. My sister wives and I were fully aware that our people were not exactly law abiding citizens when it came to federal and state laws. Our people had a passive, aggressive, rebellious mentality against government that showed up nearly every day in nearly everything we did. Whenever possible, we went only to FLDS doctors or those who agreed not to keep medical records on us, and we paid cash for their services. Sometimes our ways held serious consequences, like the unnecessary deaths we hid from the government. Although Merrill's and Lyle's boys often boasted of direct OSHA violations, Our boys were well trained with tools, and I hadn't thought much about safety or construction sites until a child died on a workstation. We all grieved for him and his family. It had happened more than once, but everyone kept it quiet to avoid inevitable prosecution. So the kids' lives don't even matter. It's just every year, with every incident that could incriminate us in the eyes of the outside world, it seemed more and more important to keep our records safe from prying eyes. And that is going to be the end of the reading. I just, I cannot believe how he managed to get away with so much for so long. Anyways, you all let me know what you thought this chapter reading. Like the video as it helps the channel. Until next time.